In the part 2 of chapter 5, we first spend a little bit of time on explaining each and every of these three major macroeconomic concerns. And these, as I told you, is number one, aggregate output growth, and number two, the level of unemployment, and number three, inflation, or let me also put deflation. Okay, so these are the major issues that we need to address. So basically, we first start talking about the aggregate output. The aggregate output, in fact, the word is the aggregate output, and I want to highlight that. And its growth. So what is aggregate output? We are inventing something as the aggregate output. This is the total goods and services produced in an economy. Let's say it's the variable y, okay, in a specific year. So we can measure it for next year also, and we have a measure from previous year. And then we will define that the growth is if we are here, we take the value of now, subtract it from the value of the previous year, divided by the value of the previous year, and we may actually multiply it by 100 also, and say this is basically percentage growth as compared to the 2000, as compared to 2009, we have minus 3% growth, and in another year we have 5% positive growth. So this is basically giving us an indicator that are we doing well or are we doing bad. And in this process, if we draw it over time, okay, the aggregate output, we put it in the vertical axis, and as the time passes, it's if it goes smoothly positively, we have no problem. So this is a smooth growth or long run smooth growth. Usually this is not happening like this, and in reality quite oppositely, we have ups and downs. Okay, so these ups and downs have some terminology which macroeconomists have developed. So let's talk about that. So a business, we are referring to the business cycles. These are the short-term ups and downs in an economy, and aggregate output is the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy. In chapter 6, we are extensively explaining how we basically can measure the aggregate output or aggregate income. Here we might have actually expansion or boom, as I said. If it's positive growth, the period of which business cycles, it's towards good one, towards improvement, okay? And it starts from a very low, we call it trough, to the highest possible, we call it peak. So these are new terminology which you should be familiar with, okay? A business cycle expansion or boom relates a movement from a relatively minimal point of GDP, growing to the relatively highest possible during which output employment is positively growing, okay? On the contrary, we have something called contraction as opposed to expansion, and recession or slump as opposed to the boom. Okay, there are other words also for these terminology for these two cases. So this is positive growth in percentage, whereas this one is negative growth of in percentage. If the economy is, as compared to the previous years, the aggregate output or the GDP is going downward, we call it the period of which from the peak starts and goes to another trough. Okay, and in this situation, output and employment, both of them are falling, so it's got a negative impression. And the depression, we would say that if a recession is very prolonged, we call it depression. So a deep recession is called a prolonged and deep recession is called depression. So these are the terminology which we can put it in a graph as I was trying to draw. In fact, the period of which economy expands, this is called expansion period or booming period. And a period of which the economy goes downward, this is called contraction period or recession. If this duration is very long, then we call it depression. It might be actually 2 years, 3 years, as low as 2 consecutive quarter, 6 months. If it is negative, we say that we are in recession technically. But if it is 5 years, 6 years, we call it depression. And depression is a negative growth, okay? Negative growth. So we have this terminology. The trough is the local minimum and the peak are local maximum. So it may actually goes down again. So this is also going up again. Okay, so we have troughs, we have peaks, and the full cycle is starting from the trough, ending to the next trough, or starting from a peak, ending to the next peak. So this is a full cycle, full cycle. So a full cycle has to have at least one trough and one peak. Starting from trough, you end up to the next one. That's a full cycle. Starting from a peak, and this is a full cycle. This is a full cycle. Okay, at least have to have one trough and one peak. So if you start from a peak, you have to have 2 peaks and 1 trough. This is a full cycle. And this is the way that it looks in the actual data. And you may wish to actually draw some approximate trends. So we had a trend like this during, pardon me, I am not good. So this is a trend over here, which is suddenly dropped for very long time, actually for nearly 10 years. This is the Great Depression. The Great Depression of 1930s started in 1929 and finished nearly to 1928. So nearly 10 years, that's a very prolonged, we call it the recession, and we use the because it's very famous, the Great Depression. We had another one in 1920s over here, but this was even longer. And then we had between the two wars, we had a growth, but we had also here another period of short term, and then the Second World. So this was the First World War, and this is the Second World War. Of course, the wars are bringing mess, so the economy dropped, and then it picked up, except some periods which we have downturn, but overall it's growing trend like this. So the trend is positive. I'm not sure if we connect it, it's gonna be lower or higher than this, but these ups and downs, which we showed it simplified in this diagram, can be realized in so the cycles are not very in a specific pattern or order. It is actually very random, very unpredictable. So if I want to simplify, it may go like this. If it's going like this, it's a pattern, but in reality you see that it's like this, and then suddenly drops, and then goes up, and suddenly drops for quite a long time, and the speed of the growth is also different. So the frequency of these cycles are not necessarily like a sinus curve in a specific pattern that you can predict it. It's unpredictable, suddenly comes and suddenly hits the economy, and therefore we need a model to do our best to predict it in advance. If we can predict it in advance, we may actually cure it before it happens. Same story for the unemployment rate, so the percentage of labor force that is unemployed. So we have a portion of the society which are seeking job and looking for job, and some of them finding, some of them not. The ones who are not finding job, a portion of the labor force which are unemployed, the percentage change is called high unemployment rate. So in chapter 7 we are gonna precisely define and measure it. So usually when the economy is in downturn, the rate of unemployment is very high and problematic. So, and with regards to the inflation, and we have the expression of inflation. So if you imagine that you have a price level or price index in the base year and the price index in year 1, you also can say that inflation is basically P1 minus P0 divided by P0 multiplied by 100. So it's a percentage change, and you can have the previous year or a year after. So if it is T or T minus 1, similar definition as the GDP growth. So inflation is the growth of percentage growth of the overall price index. And if it is positive, we call it inflation. If it is negative, we call it deflation. And if it is very high, double digit, we call it hyperinflation. I have never heard about hyperdeflation, but hyperinflation is very likely. So it's positive and it's severely. Like in Iran, we have faced several periods of hyperinflation. Or in Turkey, we had hyperinflation. In Germany, in 1920s, super hyperinflation, hundreds of millions percentage for 1 year. In Zimbabwe or in Argentina in modern time, we had hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is very crazy. Your money buys less. So people are losing the purchasing power of their money, and they get frustrated, and it may actually create a lot of tension in the society. But a smooth growth of the prices, they call it core inflation, it may not be an issue. People are used to it, and it may actually bring some positive gain for the producers to make more effort. So both inflation and deflation are bad, but being sustained inflation is very important. Sustained inflation is an inflation. If it is 1%, it keeps 1% over a period. So we are having a positive growth every year, 1% more, but it's not going to basically hit the economy as such because it's sustained. But an inflation which here is 1%, here is 4%, here is 20%, this is crazy. So this is accelerated inflation is problematic. Or deceleration also may become problematic regarding the deflation. Okay, if you want to understand these things, we need to develop another framework which we had already explained in the chapter 1 and 2. It's called circular flow diagram. Is explaining who are the major players of the game of macroeconomy. Basically, we have 4 groups. Families, we have families, we have consumers, we have producers, we have governors, and we have other countries. So in other countries, we have also producers, governments, and households. So these are what we call them, the entity. These are their act. Economic act of the household is basically consumption. Let me write it here, consumption. And economic act of the firms are production. And economic act of the government is to govern or manage. And these are all of them in other countries. Okay, so we have consumers, producers, and governors of other countries. So this number 4 is also shows that economy is open. We might have actually, if you have only this, we call economy closed economy. So if we have other household firms and governments of other countries dealing with us, we have interactions with our neighboring countries, in GCC countries. So our economy is open. We do import and export. So our families can buy a foreign product, and the foreigners are buying Omani products. So this is basically open economy. So I will do it this way, but later I will show the slides. So I would say that let's have a contract that rectangles are showing the players or actors, and the way that they go and do the trade, we use the oval or circle. So these are the markets. Okay, so how many of these we have? We have 4 actors or players. So this is the way that I do, and I like this way, and I am sure, how can I reduce this? Okay. So we would put players of the game in the rectangles. These are domestic players. So I will have 4 of them. 1 household, 2 firms, 3 governments, and 4 rest of the world. So I put the rest of the world over here. Rest of the world. And this is my family's household. This is my producers' firms, and this is my government. And then I use the markets. So we have one market, which is the product markets. Product markets. We did this in the previous chapter. So this is goods and services market. And then we have below how many factors of production we had. We had land or resources, labor and capital, and entrepreneurship. So the major one is labor and other resources. And capital, we can separate it into another circle. So this is capital or money market. Okay, so the flows is physically the firms are sending the goods here, and then they collect the money back, and they pay their factors of production, and they receive the land, labor, capital like this. So clockwise, counterclockwise, we follow the only money flow. So the money they receive from selling all goods and services, it's called aggregate output. Aggregate output. And the money which they pay, including the entrepreneurship which takes the profit, it's called the aggregate income. Aggregate income. So there should be balance. So the money flows in, will flow to the factors of production, and the factors of production basically come to the household to decide how to spend it. But in between, the government is also taking the tax. So Y after the tax is cut is called disposable income. Disposable income is the money which ultimately comes to the families. And the families here are, I can use another color. They decide to spend aggregate consumption expenditure of the family. We use it with C. Or they may actually decide to save it. So lend it to those who wants to borrow it. And who would be that? If the money comes here and they're gonna be borrowed by the producers to buy machines and equipments, where they get machines and equipments, they buy it from the goods market. So this is what we call it investment. Investment by mostly by the firms. And what the government is doing with this tax, they are also going and spending. It's government spending. So let me put this one as the gov. So different notations. So this gov, this is government spending. Government spending. And what is the other one? If we buy from the foreigners or they buy from us. So if we buy from them, money goes out. Sorry, it's import. So it's negative, minus M if we buy from them. If they buy from us, the money flows in, so it's export. So it's called X and M. All these red ones are showing the aggregate expenditure. All right. So in this flow, which the book is showing it with some graphics, it looks like this. But the problem is that it does not show the markets. So I have described, so there should be actually a markets of factors of production here, input market, land, labor, capital, and a market here for goods and services. And it doesn't separate actually the capital market or money market. So I like this way, which shows all the players and all the major markets. And if we understand their behavior, we are able to explain the trio problems: growth, unemployment, and inflation. So it's very interesting that this is quite different from the way that the microeconomics is explaining the economy. In microeconomics, we have thousands of individual markets, and everyone, if it's a flexible pricing mechanism, then there would be no issues about the growth, no issues about the unemployment, no issues about the inflation. That is the analysis. So in this circular flow diagram showing the flow of the money and also physical, we removed it, we did it counterclockwise. The flow of the money should be balanced constantly, because every economy, if there is an unequilibrium or disequilibrium, then economy is in trouble. So as I told you, there are three major markets which we need to understand their equilibrium at macro level, and that's number one, goods and services market, number two, the labor market, and number three, the financial market or money market or capital market. Let me call it capital. So three names: money market, financial market, or capital market. This is the one that I drew it separately here. So in the core chapter, we start from goods market and we discussed its equilibrium, and then we come and discuss the money market equilibrium, and then we would say that how two equilibriums can happen at the same time, and we bring the labor market indirectly to this analysis, and we will give a full picture of a good economy at macro level. So this is the goods and services and the players and the definition of each. Labor market and money market, you can read it through. And in the money market, we might have actually another player which is a part of the government, and it is, in most countries, is a part of the government. It is the central bank. In the United States, it's independent, entirely private sector and entirely independent from the government, but the government oversees its action also. So we have the executive government where the tax and spending are done. So we have fiscal policy where the level of tax and government spending is determined, and we have another part policy which called monetary policy. So they are focusing on the money supply. So they have a policy which they decides how much the money supply is suitable for the economy. It's like the blood, money is like the blood in the body of the economy. Sometimes we are lacking it, So the central bank decides to increase it. Sometimes the central bank says it's basically caused a lot of overheat in the economy. So inflation is a monetary issue. We are going to explain it. So they are basically removing the money from the circulation for curing the inflation. Okay, so that is with the policy settings. We can also describe the economic actions for correcting any mistakes. So if we have negative growth or high unemployment or inflation, either the government or the central bank may do some actions, which the actions is called policies, to correct the economy. So these are the things which are explained through the influence of the government, be it a treasury department or be it a central bank, into the performance of the markets. If they are too far away from a suitable or desirable equilibrium, then they can correct them. And we will go through these things, this terminology of the money bank, like treasury bonds, corporate bonds, shares of stocks, dividends, into when the chapters comes. And as this is important for you to know at this stage, that the actions of the government is classified into two types: fiscal policy, which deals with tax, subsidies, and spending, government spending. So G and T. And the monetary policy is dealing with the level of money supply, the tools of which Federal Reserve or the central bank is to control the interest rate and money supply. So interest rate is also very important variable in macroeconomy. So let me stop it here, and then we put it into the context, historical context, and then we will move to another chapter. Thank you.